People think obsessively tracking NBME scores is helping, but they're overlooking how this habit is actually killing Step 2 performance. The NBME has hidden data showing nearly 1 in 4 students scores 20 or more points higher or lower than predicted. I've seen students who were supposed to score in the 240s end up with 260s, while others predicted for 260s fall far short. The difference isn't luck or knowledge gaps, it's understanding the 10 score killers that quietly destroy Step 2 performance, starting with the toxic relationship most students have with their practice scores. Today I'll expose the suppressed NBME data and reveal all 10 overlooked score killers, plus give you the complete framework to outperform any prediction and score higher than anyone expects. Score killer number 1 is using Step 1 strategies for Step 2. The biggest mistake students make is treating Step 2 like it's Step 1 with management questions. Specifically, Step 1 rewards applying concepts to idealized scenarios, but Step 2 punishes students who rely on that same approach. So what is the reality? Step 1 is more idealized. It uses classic presentations that match textbook descriptions. In contrast, Step 2 is more gritty and real world. If you've ever heard the phrase, patients don't read the textbooks, the same could be used to describe Step 2. It's got messier presentations that don't fit perfect patterns. In educational lingo, Step 1 has a stronger signal with clearer, more predictable scenarios. Step 2, in contrast, deliberately includes more noise, the purpose of which is to give more real-world complexity that tests your interpretation skills. What this means is that Step 2 and shelf exams create the perfect trap for memorizers. Memorization strategies like using pre-made Anki decks where you're going to cram tons and tons of facts can work for Step 1 because the presentations on Step 1 are generally going to be more idealized. Now granted, memorizing all of the information in 40,000 or more cards is not an efficient way to study for Step 1. However, students can pass by recognizing patterns. To pass Step 1, you just have to be above the bottom 3%. So while it may not be very efficient, if you're smart enough and you work hard enough, you can still get above the bottom 3%. For Step 2, however, memorization is actively punishing you. First, you're not going to find classic textbook presentations. For Step 2 vignettes, and with real patients, they're not going to present like the perfect Anki cards that you may be cramming. Instead, you have to develop interpretation skills to handle the gritty, real-world type scenarios. So what do high scorers do instead? They focus on developing systematic approaches to break down complex clinical scenarios rather than memorizing more isolated facts. Before we break down those systemic approaches to help you increase your score immediately, here's what's really sabotaging your performance. You're focusing on the wrong path to high scores entirely. Score killer number 2 is focusing only on content and ignoring process. Getting a 260 plus on Step 2 is really simple. You need to apply the right concepts and you need to avoid dumb mistakes. But most students obsess over the first and ignore the second. That second one, avoiding dumb mistakes, is huge. It's about question interpretation, how you read and break down each question, and how you avoid unforced errors. That's what makes or breaks your score. In our analysis of students' practice tests, we routinely find that 50% or more of missed questions are due to test-taking errors, not knowledge gaps. This is the part that varies most day to day. Sleep, stress, attention, stamina, all of these things can throw you off and lead to preventable mistakes that can tank your score. It's one thing to recognize that making dumb mistakes is keeping you from a 260, it's a completely different thing to fix it. The first thing you have to do to fix this is that you have to focus on it. Most people that get to the 230s or 240s got there by working on their knowledge gaps. This is important to continue and you should keep doing that. But if you're in this range, you have to make sure that you're working on the process as well. Here's what process mastery looks like. First, you need to have a consistent framework for reading every vignette. Second, you want to develop a systematic approach to evaluating answer choices so that you don't eliminate the right answer. If you're like most people, you probably have seen plenty of questions where you've crossed out the correct answer and chosen something incorrect. The third thing is that you want to develop mental resilience techniques for difficult questions. And then finally, you want to have error tracking to identify patterns and mistakes. Speaking of systematic approaches, most students are reading questions completely wrong, and it's going to prevent them from getting a 260. Score killer number 3 is reading questions without a system. The difference between a 230 and a 260 isn't what you know, it's how you systematically break down every single question. What most students do is what I call the chaos approach. Oftentimes, these students are feeling panicked and they feel time time pressure. They've probably been told that they need to read the last sentence first, and then they find themselves scanning for buzzwords. They'll read frantically through the vignette hoping that something jumps out, and then because the vignettes are so long, especially on the newer NBMEs, they get overwhelmed by all the details and miss the big picture. To fix this, use the context chronology severity framework. First, let's talk context. Very few symptoms in medicine are truly pathognomonic, meaning very few symptoms by themselves would allow you to know the diagnosis just from having it. What high scorers do to minimize dumb mistakes is that they ask themselves, what does this mean in context? Or how does this connect to what I've already seen? They're not looking for single buzzwords. Instead, they build connections between multiple pieces of information. Next, let's talk chronology. Test writers deliberately present information that's out of order. Something that will instantly increase your scores is to rearrange everything in the present tense in chronological order. For example, a 25-year-old woman presents to the emergency department with 3 hours of acute chest pain. 7 days ago, she returned from a long international flight. 8 weeks ago, she started taking oral contraceptive pills for birth control. Now let's take it and rearrange it in chronologic order in the present tense. A 25-year-old woman starts taking OCPs. 7 weeks later, she gets on a long flight. 5 days after that, she has 3 hours of chest pain. Now ask yourself, which makes the DVT to PE progression more obvious? Most likely it's the second version. Up to 40% of step 2 questions hinge on management. What most people do is they just try to memorize a bunch of random details. Instead, you can instantly increase your score without learning more information by recognizing one key insight. Management questions really hinge on 2 things. First, you need to know the diagnosis, and second, you need to know the severity. The more severe something is, the more invasive the interventions are going to be. I was coaching a student from Harvard Medical School once, and he was really good at understanding details. He had gone to Princeton for undergrad and a really prestigious high school. One of the key things that he did, he worked really hard and he was really good at memorizing details. He brought out his UWorld and told me, I think UWorld is wrong. He then showed me 2 different cases of diverticulitis, one of which the management was IV fluids and antibiotics, and the other was that they took them straight to the OR. He was beside himself. He was like, I don't understand. These are both diverticulitis patients. How is it that in one case we're giving them IV fluids and antibiotics, and the other one they're going to the OR? How is I supposed to know this? What he was missing was the severity. In the case of the IV fluids and antibiotics, the patient wasn't presenting to the emergency department. They weren't hypotensive. They didn't have high heart rate. In the other case, the patient was brought to the emergency department, which is one of the most severe presentations that you can find. In addition, they had signs of shock, where their heart rate was really high and their blood pressure was really low, and they had signs of end organ dysfunction. They were drowsy because the low blood pressure was leading to decreased perfusion to their brain, and they had low urine output. It was the same diagnosis, however, because of the different severity, there were completely different management options. But even with perfect question reading, there's a shocking revelation about the scores you're obsessing over. That brings us to score killer number 4, believing the NBME predictions are accurate. Here's the data the NBME doesn't want you to see, and it will completely change how you view your practice scores. Before step 1 went pass-fail, they included these statistics in the NBME score report. For step 1, they said 2/3 of students will score within 13 points of their NBME from within 1 week. For step 2, they said that 2/3 of students will score within 15 points of their NBME from within 1 week. On the surface, this may not seem like a very big difference. However, when we dig into the numbers more carefully, we see dramatic differences in the predictive abilities of the NBMEs for step 1 and step 2. Before step 1 went pass-fail, the NBME published some remarkable statistics about the accuracy of the practice exams relative to the final scores for students. According to the NBME's own data, the likelihood that your final score is equal or greater than the last NBME that you took within 1 week, for step 1 it was 68%, and for step 2 it was 77%. So in other words, for more than 3/4 of students, the NBMEs underpredicted people's scores. More remarkable is that the likelihood that the final score was 10 or more points higher than the NBME within 1 week was 31% for step 1 and 50% for step 2. What's crazy is that the likelihood that the final score was 20 or more points higher than the NBME within 1 week was 7% for step 1 and 23% for step 2 CK. Those statistics are pretty remarkable, particularly for step 2 CK. It implies that almost 1 in 4 students will score at least 20 points higher on their actual test than predicted by the step 2 CK NBME. But let's look at the other direction, the likelihood that your score will be lower. Specifically, the NBME estimated that the likelihood that your final score was 11 or more points lower than your last NBME within 1 week was 9% for step 1 and 8% for step 2. Granted, now some of these data are for older NBMEs, but it begs the question, why not publish this for all Step 2 NBMEs like they used to, especially given the increased importance of Step 2. So if NBME predictions are this unreliable, how do most students try to gauge their readiness? They turn to something even worse, their feelings during and after the test. Score killer number 5 is trusting your during test feelings. Step 2 doesn't feel bad because you're failing, it feels bad because it's designed to make you doubt yourself. Step 2 is likely the longest exam you'll ever take. It's 320 questions over 9 hours. The vignettes are intentionally noisy, meaning that they're going to give you things that are trying to confuse you, and they're often vague. Most people have already experienced this. Your self-exams probably didn't feel great. The difference is that Step 2 just stretches that uncertainty out across the entire day, and you have to wait weeks before you know the results. But to truly understand why Step 2 feels so emotionally overwhelming, let's consider a landmark study that looked at how people remember pain. Specifically, this study looked at patients' remembered experiences of how uncomfortable or painful a colonoscopy procedure was. What they found was that people judge pain not by the average pain, but instead by the worst moment and the final moment. When people say that Step 2 is brutal, the same principle's at work. One awful question, especially late in the exam, can make the whole test feel like a failure. Let me give you an example. I had a student once who failed Step 1. He was super depressed, couldn't get out of bed. His mom literally had to drag him to the consultation because he couldn't really motivate himself to do anything. He completely transformed his approach and scored a 92% on his NBME. Note that failing Step 1 is the bottom 3%, and the 92 would be the top 3% or more on the real Step 1 before it went past fail. That's a remarkable 4 standard deviation improvement. Now, I remember talking to him after he walked out of Step 1. He was one of the most confident people that I think I've ever seen walking out of a test. He knew that he had done well, and he wasn't afraid to share it. Now let's fast forward to Step 2. His practice test scores were virtually identical to his practice test scores for Step 1. He was convinced that he had failed and that all of his preparation had been for nothing. In other words, he felt like a total failure, but his Step 2 score was actually quite high. Even more, he ended up matching into urology. So how is that possible? Remember, unlike with Step 1, the feeling of doubt is a feature, not a bug. Up until this point, most of the exams in your life, if you prepared well for a test, you probably could feel it in terms of your confidence on the day of your exam. For Step 2, it will not feel like that. They're intentionally trying to confuse you, and they're not going to give you classic presentation. The fact that you have to sit there for a full 320 questions, not knowing the result of any of the questions, and you don't know your score for 3 weeks is only going to make it feel worse. It's to the point where when people tell me that they felt awful after their test, I tend to just say, you know what, let's wait until we see your score. I don't think I've seen a single student who was well prepared going into the test and walked out feeling like they failed actually fail the test. Instead, it was pretty close to what it is that I had expected their score to be. Score killer number 6 is eliminating answer choices too quickly. The single biggest difference between average scores and 260+ scores is this: high scores rule in before they rule out. Most students approach answer choices like lawyers. They find one tiny flaw and then they'll throw out the entire option. Let's go through a real example. I had a student recently who got a question wrong where the patient was in shock. They had a fever, they had high heart rate, and they had low blood pressure. The student was thinking, oh man, this sounds a lot like sepsis, but then they noticed that the extremities were cold, which is the opposite of the classic warm extremities that you would get in hyperdynamic shock. Because this one detail didn't fit perfectly, they eliminated sepsis from their answer choices and chose something completely wrong, which was something like tamponade. This is the classic lawyer approach. They find any flaw and then eliminate that option because it didn't fit their perfect idealized view of what it should be. Instead, you want to take the approach of the judge, where you want to evaluate all evidence and go with the one that has the preponderance of evidence, not perfect evidence. A judge is someone who evaluates all evidence before making a decision. They also acknowledge that facts will not fit perfectly, which is exactly what the USMLEs are going to give you. To encourage the judge approach, try to rule in each answer choice first before you rule it out. If it's a management question, ask yourself, what condition would this be the treatment for? This will allow you to give every answer choice a fair shake, and it will provide you ample evidence for it to balance against the evidence that you're already generating in your head to rule out answer choices. If it's a diagnosis question, ask yourself, what in the vignette would make this a reasonable answer? Only after ruling in should you then rule out. Then take both sides for each answer choice that you're considering and choose the better answer. This prevents elimination based on one detail that doesn't fit and forces you to be the judge instead of the lawyer. So if NBMEs and feelings are unreliable, what actually predicts Step 2 success? That brings us to score killer number 7, ignoring the real performance predictors. While others obsess over NBME scores, there's actual research showing what really predicts Step 2 success, and most students completely ignore it. The data found that if you could only use a single data point, your Step 1 score was actually the strongest predictor of your Step 2 score. However, because we know that there was a strong correlation between people's predicted Step 1 scores and their actual Step 1 scores, we can use as a reasonable stand-in people's NBMEs for Step 1. What they found was the best predictor of people's Step 2 scores, however, was when you included 3 subject examination scores. This accounted for 67 to 69% of the variance in Step 2 CK scores. Specifically, it was the average performance across your IM, surgery, and OB/PED shelf exams that was the best overall predictor. Why might it make sense that these exams matter more than the NBMEs? Shelf exams test the same interpretation skills as Step 2. They're also taken during your actual clinical rotations when you're thinking clinically. Plus, this gives you multiple data points that are more reliable than single NBME snapshots. But knowing your real potential is useless if you're still training like a medical student instead of a championship athlete. Score killer number 8 is training like a student, not an athlete. To jump from the 230s to 260s, you need to apply the right concepts and avoid dumb mistakes. That requires training like a championship mental athlete. What do I mean? A student crams more facts and hopes for the best on test day. Instead, a championship mental athlete is going to develop the consistent systems that perform under even extreme pressure. You have to approach every question the same way every single time. That means that you need to practice doing the right things consistently under pressure until it becomes so natural that you can do it in your sleep. Every single 260 plus scorer that I've ever met uses a systematic approach for every question, not just the hard ones. Think of Steph Curry. He makes 500 three-point shots daily during the offseason. Not just takes 500 shots, but actually makes them. In games, he might only take 10 or 15 three-point shots, but he's prepared with thousands of makes in practice for those few opportunities that he has in a game. Your approach should be the same. You want to practice the same systematic question framework on every single practice question, so that when you face those crucial 320 questions on Step 2, your process is automatic and flawless. Let's take, for example, your pre-question routine. You want to experiment with different approaches and find what works for you. Maybe you have trouble getting into a groove on tests. I worked with a student recently who would consistently get 30 to 50% more questions wrong in their first block or two than they would in the final blocks. In other words, it took them time to get going. So what might you do if you have this kind of issue? You would want to experiment with different techniques. Maybe you take a chocolate-covered espresso bean to give yourself a little caffeine boost before you start the block. Or maybe you practice by doing 5 or 10 questions before you even start your test so that you can get rid of those pre-test jitters. Maybe use visualization. Whatever it is, you need to experiment and keep tracking it for yourself so that you know what works. Then when you find what works, you want to make sure that you do it every single time. During questions, you want to use the context, chronology, severity framework every time. You want to simplify the question so that you can understand what the test writer is asking. You want to use this systematic approach, whether it's question 1 or question 320. In addition, for answer choices, you want to rule in before ruling out on every question. You want to be the judge, not the lawyer, consistently. Don't give in to the temptation of skipping this systematic evaluation for the easy questions. Remember, every question is worth the exact same on every test. Even if you have an 80% chance of getting a question right, if you can increase that likelihood to 90% by being more consistent with your approach, that will increase your score by 10% if you do this for every question on the exam. Your brain needs consistency so that when you get under pressure, it just becomes routine and natural. And speaking of pressure, nothing derails mental athletes faster than letting one impossible question destroy their confidence. Score killer number 9 is letting hard questions create spirals. The difference between good test takers and great ones isn't never missing questions, it's recovering instantly when they do. Oftentimes on tests like Step 2, we see that some people miss multiple questions in a row in a way that suggests that it's not just random. Tell me if this sounds familiar. A student encounters a brutal question and thinks, "Oh my God, I should know this." They start beating themselves up, and then they can't focus on subsequent questions because they're still replaying the previous question in their mind. One phrase you hear from professional athletes a lot is that the other side is paid to play too, meaning that when you do your best, the opposition, which in this case is the test writers, is also doing their best. So how do you recover from difficult questions so that you can stay on the path of getting a 260? First, you want to acknowledge good questions. Say something like, "Wow, that was a really good question. You got me on that one." Then compliment the test writer instead of criticizing yourself. Next, have something that allows you to reset quickly. Maybe it's taking a breath. For me, it was taking a deep breath and reminding myself that difficult questions are normal. I know that I prepared well, so if it's hard for me, God help the other people that have to deal with that question. Finally, refocus. Say, I'll get you next time, and then move on to the next question. The reason that this works is that your ability to recover is more important than your ability to never make mistakes. Championship athletes never run the table, meaning they're never going to get every single point and have the other side not score anything. That's just the nature of the beast. Instead, every single time you see a difficult question, allow yourself to reframe it. Use that as a sign of, wow, look at how far I've come in my life. I've prepared well for one of the hardest exams in the world, and I'm still standing. But even the best recovery skills won't help you if you're flying blind about your actual weaknesses. This brings us to score killer number 10, not tracking what actually matters. What you measure improves, and what you track daily completely transforms. But most students track the wrong things. There was a research study that was done on people that were trying to lose weight. What they did is they told one group of people to weigh themselves daily who wanted to lose weight. The other group they told, weigh yourselves when you feel like it. The results were staggering. The people that weighed themselves daily lost nearly 3 times as much weight as the other group. So what does this mean if you want to score higher on step 2? It means that you need to track the things that you're doing if you want to accomplish more. At a minimum, you should track the number of questions that you're completing and ideally the percentage correct. What high scorers track, however, is much more granular. They're going to focus on things like the specific error types and their frequency. Remember, if 50% or more of the questions that you're missing are because of test taking errors or dumb mistakes and not knowledge, then what you need to do is to track every single one of those errors. Here's a list to get you started. First, track context, chronology, severity errors. How many times did I skip these steps? How many times would rearranging something chronologically have helped me? Or for a management question, if I look back at the severity, how many times would that have helped me to get a management question correct? Second, judge versus lawyer. How many times was I the lawyer instead of the judge? Where were the questions where I had crossed out the correct answer? That's typically a sign that you're the lawyer, not the judge. Next, rule in and rule out. When did I eliminate something too quickly without ruling it in? Fourth, look at the emotional spirals. When did one question affect the next one? Where were times where I got 2 or 3 or 4 questions wrong in a row because I couldn't stop thinking about that first one? Then finally, where were the knowledge gaps? Typically what we find is that about 50% of the questions that you're missing are actually just issues of content. Remember, measuring this stuff is going to feel uncomfortable. Just like when I weigh myself daily if I'm trying to lose weight, it can feel really uncomfortable because I can see when I'm letting myself go. It's natural to want to stop. However, remember that comfort is the enemy of improvement. These 10 score killers can transform your step 2 performance immediately, but knowing and implementing are 2 different things. That's why I created the UWorld Complete Guide, the 5 levels of mastery to 260+, where I break down the exact settings and realistic milestones for every starting point, even if you're below passing. Don't waste time with the generic advice that you should do 100 or more questions a day. Instead, get a proven framework that works whether you're scoring 40% or already in the 240s pushing for 270+. You're not bad at test taking, you just need the right approach. Check out the UWorld Complete Guide and turn these score killers into your secret weapons.